Now, obviously, there have been many wonderful women composers and writers and artists for hundreds of years. But there certainly was limitations on the education that a lot of women could get. Weren't allowed to even study composing as a women in most conservatories until into the 20th century. The wonderful pianist Amy Fay, who studied with Franz Liszt, actually said it really well. She said, "Women have been too much taken up with helping and encouraging men instead of placing a proper value on their own talent, which they are too prone to underestimate and to think not worth making the most of." And this is sort of the saddest idea of it all. And we're going to see it in some of these composers who internalized this society's feelings against women as composers and limited themselves. And that comes up most powerfully in the music of Clara Schumann, who was one of the finest pianists of the 19th century. Her father, Friedrich, had trained her from an early age to be just a miraculous pianist, not just an automaton, but a musical soul who, when people heard, wept openly at the beauty of her playing. She actually couldn't even speak until she was 5 years old, but she could play the piano much earlier. She had met the young pianist Robert Schumann at a party in 1830. Schumann at the time was in law school, which of course I had done at some point. He later drops out to try to become a great pianist and ends up studying with Friedrich Wieck. Clara's father ends up living in the home with young Clara, who's then about 12, 13 years old. And they sort of fall in love, and they have their first kiss when she's about 16 years old in 1835. In the middle of her career, she's already started performing all across Europe by the time she was 12 and 13 years old. After their first kiss, the father rips her out of the home and takes her on these long tours for like a year and a half, hoping that she'll forget about Robert and move on, because he wants her to be a great pianist and not get stuck with some loser pianist like Robert Schumann. But in the end, they fall in love. It's a beautiful love story. The father forbids it all the way. In fact, they have to go to court in order to get the right to get married because she's still a minor at the time. And they end up getting married in 1840. And they would have 8 children. And she's still trying to have a career as a pianist with these 8 children and dealing with her crazy husband, Schumann, who probably was bipolar or schizophrenic and ultimately tries to kill himself in 1854. And he does die in an insane asylum 2 years later. And she really spends most of her life after his death playing his music, because when he died, he really wasn't that famous as a composer. She sort of single-handedly made his music so beautiful. But all along, while she was playing, she was composing. In fact, she wrote pieces when she was 15 and 16 years old that are just remarkable to play. Saddest of all, in her diary of 1838, she wrote the following: "I once believed that I had creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not wish to compose. There never was one able to do it. Am I intended to be the one? It would be arrogant for me to believe that. That was something with which my father tempted me in former days, but I soon gave up believing this. May Robert always create. That must always make me happy." So it's almost really sad that she married a composer, because she had it in her, but felt that once they got married, that was his world and her job was a pianist, and she really didn't do a lot of composing once they got into their marriage. In fact, she wrote a letter to Robert in 1839 saying, "I have a peculiar aversion to showing you anything that I have composed. I am always ashamed. Women always betray themselves in their own compositions." But she did go on composing, and in fact, in 1853, just before Robert tries to kill himself, she writes a letter to Brahms, her new friend. "There is nothing which surpasses the joy of creation, if only because through it one wins hours of self-forgetfulness when one lives in a world of sound. When I am able to compose regularly, I feel really in my element. Quite a different feeling seems to come over me. I am much freer and lighter, and everything seems to me bright and cheerful. There is nothing greater than the joy of composing something oneself and then listening to it. So she obviously still loved to compose. And her husband, I think, recognized that there was some greatness inside of her. He wrote the following. This is in 1842, or just after they were married. Clara has written a number of smaller pieces recently that show a musical and tender invention that she has never attained before. But to have children and a husband who is always living in the realms of imagination do not go together well with composition. She cannot work at it regularly, and I am often disturbed to think how many profound ideas are lost because she cannot work them out. But Clara herself knows that her main occupation is as a mother, and I believe she is happy in the circumstances and would not want them changed. She ultimately writes this trio in 1846, one of her few chamber music works. Often she was writing solo piano pieces or songs, but this she writes as a chamber music piece in between May and September of 1846. And she actually thinks it's pretty good when she first writes it. She puts in her diary, "There are some pretty good passages in the trio, and I think it is fairly successful as far as form goes. Of course, it is only a woman's work, which is always lacking in force, in here and there in invention." And then, sadly, that same year, Robert Schumann wrote a piano trio as well. And once she saw that, she said, "I received the printed copy of my trio today, but I did not care for it particularly after hearing Robert's trio. Mine sounded effeminate and sentimental." So it is really just a sad thing to listen to Clara demean her own work. And I think you'll hear in the first movement of this trio that we're going to play, an Allegro Moderato, just the power and the beauty of her composing. I hope you enjoy the first movement of Clara Schumann's piano trio in G minor, written in 1846. Our next composer is also someone with a name that is familiar. It's Fanny Mendelssohn, or as she was known, Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel. She was the sister to Felix Mendelssohn, her more famous brother. But both of them were phenomenal young talents. They were the granddaughter, she was the granddaughter of the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, a wonderful Jewish philosopher and thinker. And the father, Abraham, had converted the children to Christianity when Fanny was 11 and Felix was 7, largely because of some new laws in Germany at the time, which made it very difficult for any Jew to attain a position in the state, and were rather anti-Semitic hope for not having any Jews at all in the country. But the father was a wealthy banker. He had made quite a lot of money, and the home was a center for music in Berlin. They would have musicians come there every Sunday almost for these Sunday salons, and Felix and Fanny would grow up listening to this wonderful music, and she was given lessons at a very early age, and both she and Felix were remarkable young prodigies. In fact, for her 13th birthday, her present was to memorize all of Book 1 of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, something that's really difficult, and played it for her father. Her mother always said that she was born with Bach fugue fingers. She started composing music when she was 14 years old and would ultimately write over 460 works, including this piano trio, again, at the end of her life, that we're going to play a movement of. It was clear, though, that this could not be a profession for her. Her father writes to her in 1820 when she's 15 years old. "Perhaps music will be Felix's profession, but for you it can and must be but an ornament and never the fundamental baseline of your existence and activity." And then in 1828, when she was now in her early 20s, and I think the father wanted her to get going on marriage and children, he said the following: "You must take yourself in hand and concentrate harder. You must school yourself more seriously and eagerly for your true profession, that is, a young woman's only profession, the state of being a housewife." Now, she ultimately does get married the next year to a painter, William Hensel, who was actually very supportive of Fanny's composition. He sort of makes her go and write every morning, unlike her father and brother, who were not very supportive of her doing her composition. They had one son together, who they named Sebastian Ludwig Felix, named after her three favorite composers, Bach, Beethoven, and Mendelssohn. It was this son who would write the first book about Fanny and let us know a little bit more about her as a composer, because when she died, very few people knew her music. Her father dies in 1836, and she hopes that maybe Felix, knowing how good a composer she is, will now encourage her to compose. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Even the mother says to Felix, "Shouldn't Fanny be allowed to publish some music now?" And he says the following: "From my knowledge of Fanny, I should say that she has neither inclination nor vocation for composing. She is too much all that a woman ought to be for this. She regulates her house and neither thinks of the public nor of the musical world, nor even of music at all, until her first duties are fulfilled. Publishing would only disturb her in these, and I cannot say that I approve of it." Now, obviously, this is not what Fanny was thinking, because in the same year, she writes to a friend of hers, Karl Klingemann, who had taken some interest in her pieces, and she said the following: "Dear Karl, I enclose 2 piano pieces which I have just written. I must add that it is certainly a pleasure to find a public for my little pieces, for here I have none at all. My songs lie unheeded and unknown. If nobody ever offers an opinion or takes the slightest interest in one's creative productions, one loses in time not only all pleasure in them, but all power of judging their value and the wish to create more. I am thus more or less alone with my music. But my own delight in making music and Hensel's good sympathies keep me awake," that's her husband, "and I cannot help considering it a sign of talent that I do not give it up altogether, though I can get nobody to take an interest in my efforts." But she is persistent, and over the next years, even while running her home and continuing the Sunday salons that her mother does, She writes pieces, and even at the end of her life, which is a short life, she would die in the same year that she finishes this trio, 1847. So she dies at the age of 42. In 1846, the year before her death, she finally decides she's going to publish, whether Felix likes it or not. And she writes to him, "I don't expect you to read this rubbish now, busy as you are, but I want to tell you something. Laugh at me or not, as you wish. In a word, I am going to publish. I hope I won't disgrace all of you. I know you won't really mind. As you can see, I've proceeded completely on my own to spare you any unpleasant moments, and if it all goes to the bad, I can have no one to blame but myself. Please don't think too badly of me." So sadly, she does finally get her music out, and then shortly after would die of a stroke. But she actually writes in her diary in February of 1847, talking about how people now are talking about her own composition. She said, "It is enticing to have this manner of success at an age when such pleasures for women who experience them at all are usually at an end." So I think you'll see in the second movement of this wonderful piano trio, Opus 11, that she writes in 1847, just a couple months before her death, and actually Felix gets this out and publishes it after he finds it, that this is a remarkable woman who has many, many great pieces that are still being discovered. We hope you enjoy Fanny Mendelssohn's trio. All right, before we do our next piece, we're actually going to get set up. I forgot that we usually try to show the hands of the piano on a big screen there at the Baltimore Hebrew congregation. We can't do that because we're in my house, but we do have a little TV here that we're going to try to let you see the hands for those of you who like to watch that go on. Won't be as clear, but we're trying to make it as similar as we can to the programs there at the synagogue. And our next work is by a French composer, Louise Farenc, who again is not widely known. Born in 1804, dies in 1875, was the daughter of a sculptor in Paris. She was a very well-known composer during her lifetime and then basically got lost. She studied composition as a young girl with Anton Reicha, who was a fairly well-known composer and friend of Beethoven. She went to the Paris Conservatory as a young girl as a pianist, and while she was there, she met Aristide Farenc, who was a flute player, and they started playing concerts together, and they actually toured extensively around Europe. She ends up marrying him at the age of 17 in 1821. He would then go on to begin the Édition Farenc, which she helped with, one of the leading music publishers in France for the next 40 or 50 years. She helped edit the book, The Treasure of Pianists, lots of formerly unknown pieces by composers in the 16th and 17th century for piano. So really important in historically helping us put together music for the piano. She was such a great pianist and teacher that she became one of the first women hired at the Paris Conservatory in 1842 as a professor of piano there. Even though her music was performed occasionally while she was alive, as soon as she died, it really faded away. And of course, part of the issue was that she was a woman, but the other issue was that she was writing symphonies and chamber music in France at a time when really all people wanted to hear there were operas and ballets. Chamber music and symphonies were considered German music. We have a wonderful quote by Saint-Saëns, who was lamenting this fact. He said, "The composer who was bold enough to venture out into the field of instrumental music in Paris had only one form for the performance of his or her works, a concert which they had to organize themselves and to which they invited their friends and the press. One could not even think of attracting the public, that general public, The very mention of the name of a French composer on a concert placard, especially that of a living French composer, was enough to send everyone running for the hills. And François-Joseph Féty, who was an important author who wrote a lot about the different composers in Paris in the 19th century, he knew Ferenc, and he said the following: "Unfortunately, the genre of large-scale instrumental music to which Madame Ferenc, by nature and formation, felt herself called upon, involves performance resources which a composer can acquire for herself only with enormous effort. Another factor here is the public, as a rule not a very knowledgeable one, whose only standard for measuring the quality of a work is the name of its author. If the composer is unknown, the audience remains unreceptive, and the publishers, especially in France, close their ears when someone offers them a halfway decent work. Such were the obstacles that Madame Ferenc met along the way and which caused her to despair. This is the reason why her work has fallen into oblivion today, when at any other epoch, her works would have brought her great esteem." So we're going to play one of these works that has mostly been lost. It's a trio originally for flute, cello, and piano, although she said a violin could also play the part. It's difficult on flute because it's a full-bodied work, which almost needs the string, but I have played it with a flute. It's also wonderful. This we're going to play is the first movement, the Allegro, and this piece was written in 1856. I hope you enjoy Louise Ferenc. Our next work is by another French composer. Her name is Cécile Chaminade, born in 1857, would die in 1944. She was actually one of the very few very successful women, both as a pianist and as a composer. In fact, she was able to get all 400 of her works performed and published during her lifetime, which is kind of a remarkable thing. She was born in a family that really did not want her to be a musician, especially the father, who was the director of an insurance company, who once said, "Bourgeois girls are predestined to become wives and mothers, not composers." But it turned out that there was a friend of the family, Georges Bizet, the opera composer, who heard young Chaminade as a girl, and he actually called her "my little Mozart." And he encouraged her to get some training as a composer. And when the father was away on a business trip in 1877, Chaminade was able to make her first public recital at the Salle Pleyel in Paris, which was very well received. And then a few years later, she wrote this piano trio that you're going to be here, her first piano trio with some beautiful, beautiful moments in it. She would ultimately begin to support herself after the father dies in 1887 with her music. And some of it, she wrote more kind of salon-style music that would sell better. But she also wrote some really powerful music. And it's still not performed enough, but it does get out there. She herself understood the difficulties that women had. She said, "Women have not been considered a working force in the world, and the work that their sex and conditions impose upon them has not been so adjusted as to give them a little fuller scope for the development of their best self. They have been handicapped, and only few, through force of circumstances or inherent strength, have been able to get the better of that handicap." And Ambroise Thomas, another wonderful French composer and writer, said about Chaminade, "This is not a woman who composes, but a composer who happens to be a woman." And Chaminade was very popular, especially in England and America in the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, there were these Chaminade clubs that sprouted all across the New York, Philadelphia areas to promote especially young women performing and writing music. And they actually took the anagram of Chaminade's name. The C standed for concentrated and concerted effort. The H for harmony of spirit and work. The A for artistic ideals. The M for musical merit maintained. The I for inspiration. The N for notes, every kind except the promissory ones. The A for ardor and art aspiration. A D for devotion to duty. And finally, E for earnest endeavor. And she actually played in Carnegie Hall in 1908 and grossed a near record $5,000 for her concerts at the time. And in 1913, she became the first female composer inducted into the French Legion of Honor. So we're going to perform for you the very beautiful second movement from her first piano trio written in 1880. All right, so our next work, we're very excited, is by a living composer, and not just any living composer, but the sister of our trio members here, Elizabeth Borofsky, who's a fantastic pianist as well. Grew up here in Baltimore, but now lives up in the Lebanon, New Hampshire area. She's going to come on in a few seconds to give you more details about this piece that she just wrote a couple of years ago in 2018 called the Kessel Suite. And we're going to do the second movement of that piece, which is named Israel, and she'll give you a little bit more about the meaning behind it. But just a little bit about Elizabeth. She enjoys a wonderful career as a soloist and collaborative pianist and a speaker and an educator. Has performed at Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center and in over 30 countries. Has presented master classes in places such as Germany, Cuba, Japan, Poland, and Germany, and Lithuania. She is on the piano faculty of the International Music Institute and Festival, for which she is the executive director, and also the founder and director of Piano Prodigies, which offers a holistic approach to private piano instruction that balances the development of the technical, artistic, and personal sides of each student. She's also a wonderful yoga teacher and a wonderful chef and a photographer. We hope you will look her up at elizabethborofsky.com. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Elizabeth, so that you can explain the origins and the meanings behind the Kessel Suite.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Borofsky. The Kessel Trio was written for Martin Kessel. It was commissioned by his wife, Gail, and she asked me to represent his life in music. Everything from his marriage and 3 kids to his passion for skiing. And it starts off with a movement about his childhood in South Africa, then we move over to Israel, and then we finish with America. And what you're hearing today is the middle movement, Israel. It uses the theme Hatikva, which is the Israeli national anthem. I've changed it a little bit for my version, and progresses on to a dance in the traditional Israeli style, the Hora, which represents Martin's first marriage. You'll also hear reference to 3 children, and even his career in microbiology, with a little bit of experimentation between the cello and the violin taking turns playing the same part. And then at the end of the piece, the right hand of the piano part using the interval of a half step, which is the smallest interval that we can play on a piano. So the reference to microbiology. I hope you enjoy this.
Our final work today is also by a living composer. Her name is Gwyneth Walker, and I met her when I lived up in the New Hampshire area. She lived on a farm, a dairy farm in Vermont for many years, although now I think she's in New Canaan, Connecticut. She's born in 1947, went to Brown University and the Hart School of Music, and then was a faculty member at the Oberlin College Conservatory, but resigned there in 1982 so she could pursue a career as a full-time composer. She was the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Vermont Arts Council in the year 2000, just 2 years before she wrote the piece that we're going to play. And she has over 300 different works that are performed across the country. Really accessible, wonderful composer. This piece that we're going to play is called A Vision of Hills, and she describes it as an extended one-movement musical exploration of the traditional Irish hymn tune, Be Thou My Vision, which was always one of her favorite melodies. And the reference to the hills obviously comes from the views of the Vermont countryside that she could see, and this landscape really infuses the music. As she says, the opening patterns in the piano can be heard as the first light appearing over the hills in the morning. The violin and cello are like voices calling out across the valley, and as the fullness of morning arrives, the piano gets lower and louder and the melody becomes presented. In the strings, there are then these contrasting sections inspired by dancing particles of light on the hills, and this kind of oscillating, trembling texture, as she describes as a quivering reverence for nature and the landscape. And then there's a final, very powerful statement of that hymn tune in a kind of triumphant form, which she says is intended to reflect the strength of faith and of the hills. And I think it's a piece that we really could use at this difficult time. We really want to thank you for being a part of this live stream, and especially for listening to this wonderful music of women. We need to do more to get these women out there and show the power that they can present in their music, the emotional depth, and just the seriousness of their craft. So we hope you enjoy Gwyneth Walker's A Vision of Hills.